The plates had been on the table for 40 minutes, and neither child had touched them. Marcus Hale stood at the head of the dining table and looked at his children, and they looked back at him with the specific, unblinking patience of children who have decided something and are not going to be moved from it by any force available to a parent. Not coaxing, not reason. Not the slow escalation of paternal authority that had always, until 2 days ago, been sufficient to navigate the ordinary resistances of family life. Lily was 9, and she sat with her hands in her lap and her chin level and her eyes on her father, with an expression he had never seen on her face before and could not name. Noah was 6, and he was doing what Noah always did. When Lily did something, he was watching her and copying the architecture of her posture without understanding it. The way younger children absorb the forms of older ones and fill them with their own simpler content. His chin was up, his hands were in his lap, his plate was untouched. The food was cooling. The kitchen had sent it up at 6:30, as always. The same reliable rhythm of the household that Rose had established in her first month and maintained without drama or variation for 2 years and 3 months. Except that Rose was not here. Rose had not been here for 2 days. Marcus had fired her on Tuesday afternoon in the entrance hall with 3 members of household staff present, and the words had been short and final, and he had not given her the opportunity to speak because he had not trusted himself to hear what she said without either changing his mind or hardening further. And he was not prepared to change his mind, and he could not afford to harden further. Not about this. Not about his father's watch. He said, "You need to eat." Lily said, "We're not hungry." He said, "You haven't been hungry for 2 days." She said, "No." He said, "Lily." She said, "Dad." It was the flatness of it that stopped him, not defiance, not the performance of stubbornness that children sometimes produce to test boundaries, but something much quieter and much more difficult to address. Lily was 9 years old, and she was looking at her father with the level, direct attention of a person who has been thinking about something for 2 days and has arrived at a conclusion and is prepared to say it. He had seen that look before. He had seen it on his own face in boardroom mirrors, on the mornings before a difficult decision. He had not expected to see it at his dinner table on a Thursday evening on the face of his 9-year-old daughter. Noah said, "Is Rose coming back?" Marcus said, "No." Noah looked at his plate. He said, "She would have eaten with us tonight. She was going to teach me the card trick." Marcus said, "I know." Noah said, "Then why?" Marcus said, "Because something happened that I cannot overlook, and it's not a discussion I'm going to have at the dinner table." Lily said, "You didn't let her talk." He was quiet. She said, "We were at the end of the hall. We heard. You didn't let her say anything. You just said the words, and she left." She paused. She didn't cry. "Did you notice that?" He had noticed. He had been trying not to think about it for 2 days. The specific quality of Rose's composure as she received the termination, the way she had simply nodded, once, and picked up her bag from the entrance table and said, to the 3 staff members who were present and who were all looking at the floor, "Good night." Not to him, to them. As though he had already become a different category of person, one you do not say goodnight to, one you move past quietly on your way to the door. He said, "This conversation is finished for tonight." Lily said, "She used to say Grandpa was still here as long as we kept being kind. We're not being kind, Dad, so now he's really gone." The dining room was very quiet. Marcus stood at the head of his table and heard his daughter's sentence rearrange everything. Not loudly, it was a quiet sentence, delivered in a child's voice, without drama or accusation. With the specific moral clarity that children produce when they have been taught something true and have applied it correctly. It rearranged everything the way a key rearranges a lock, not violently, but precisely, each tumbler falling into its correct position, and the thing that had been closed swinging open, and what was behind it turning out to be exactly what he had been most afraid to see. He pushed back from the table. He stood. He walked to the hallway, not quickly, not with any sense of destination, simply walking because remaining seated was no longer possible. He stood in the hallway with his forehead against the wall, and his eyes closed, and the wallpaper cold against his skin, and he stayed there. He heard small feet on the floor behind him. Noah, not Lily. Lily would wait. Because Lily understood, at 9, that some things need to be moved through alone. But Noah was 6. And at 6, you do not leave people standing alone in hallways with their eyes closed, because that is not how the world is supposed to work. Noah came and stood beside him and said nothing. And after a moment, Marcus slid down the wall until he was sitting on the floor with his back against it and his knees up and his hands loose at his sides. Noah sat down beside him without being asked, with the physical certainty of a small child who knows exactly where he is supposed to be. They sat in the hallway in silence for a while. Noah said, "Is it about Grandpa's watch?" Marcus said, "Yes." Noah said, "Did she really take it?" He had been asking himself this question for 2 days. He had been asking it in the controlled, analytical way he applied to business problems, assembling the evidence, assessing the probabilities, cross-referencing the timeline. The watch had been on the desk in the study on Tuesday morning. Rose had cleaned the study on Tuesday afternoon. The watch had not been on the desk on Tuesday evening. Rose was the only person who had been in the study. The case was, by any rational measure, complete. And yet the case was a chain with one link he had not examined, which was the link between the watch leaving the desk and the watch leaving the building, and he had not examined it because examining it would require him to concede that he had made a decision based on an incomplete chain, which would require him to concede that he had been wrong, which would require him to go back. And going back meant acknowledging that he had stood in the entrance hall of his own home and ended a person's employment. A person who had been for 2 years and 3 months the most reliable and most quietly decent presence in the lives of his 2 children, without giving her 30 seconds to speak. His father would have had something to say about that. His father had always had something to say about the cost of a pride that cannot move. He said, "I don't know." Noah said, "I think she didn't." Marcus said, "Why?" Noah thought about it with the seriousness he brought to all serious questions, his brow furrowed, his head slightly tilted. Then he said, "Because she told us the watch was the most important thing in the study, that first week, when she was learning where everything went. She said it was the kind of thing that belonged somewhere specific, so it couldn't get lost. She said that about Grandpa's things, the things you kept." He paused. She wouldn't take a thing she already knew mattered that much. Marcus sat on the floor of his hallway and said nothing for a long time. Marcus Hale had built £400 million of company over 19 years through a combination of instinct and discipline that most of his competitors could identify, but none could replicate, because the combination required holding 2 contradictory capacities simultaneously: the ability to move fast and the ability to stop completely. He had learned the first from necessity. He had learned the second from his father Joseph, who had been a watchmaker by training and a businessman by circumstance, and a philosopher by disposition, and who had told him once, in the workshop behind the family home, where the smell of machine oil and old metal was as familiar as breakfast, "The watch doesn't care how quickly you wind it. It only works if every part is where it belongs." Joseph Hale had died 14 months ago, a Wednesday morning in spring, quickly and without warning, which was either merciful or cruel depending on how you measured it. And the pocket watch, his father's watch, silver-cased and initialed, and wound by 3 generations of Hale men on the same mornings, and set down on the same surfaces, and carried through the same kinds of days, had become the thing Marcus kept on the desk in his study, the way other men kept photographs, as proof that the person was real, and had been here, and had left something behind. Rose had known this. He understood that now, and it made the thing he had done worse, not better. She had known how much the watch mattered. Had known it from the children's descriptions in her first week, from Noah saying that's the one Dad keeps, the one from great-grandpa, From Lily saying Dad doesn't move it, ever, it just stays there, and Rose had understood what staying there meant, had registered it with the quiet, comprehensive attention she brought to everything in this household, and she had cared for it accordingly. She had cared for it so carefully that when it slipped behind the desk, she had wrapped it in cloth and placed it on a ledge and written a note. And he had not given her 30 seconds to tell him any of this. The thought of the watch gone was not about money. It was not even entirely about the object. It was about the severing of the last physical thread. The idea that he could reach out his hand on an ordinary Tuesday evening and the thing would not be there, and his father would be, in some final and irrevocable way, simply absent. He had not thought this through clearly when he fired Rose. He had felt it, and the feeling had been sufficient. And feelings of that magnitude do not ask permission before they become decisions. He understood now that this was precisely the kind of pain his father had warned him about. The pain that moves fastest and damages most, not the pain that announces itself and waits to be addressed, but the pain that dresses as certainty and acts before you can examine it. His father had called it, with the watchmaker's vocabulary that colored all his thinking, a stripped gear. The part that spins, but drives nothing, turns endlessly, produces force, changes nothing. He had told Marcus he had it in him. He had told him to watch for it. He had not watched for it. He had not recognized it until a 9-year-old girl said a sentence at a dinner table and the lock turned. He went to his study. He went not because he had a plan, but because he needed to be in the room where the watch had last been. The way people return to places associated with loss, as though proximity might restore something. He sat at the desk. He looked at the empty surface where the watch had stood for 14 months. He looked at the desk. He looked at it the way you look at something when you are forcing yourself to see it, rather than to see the idea of it. The desk was large, dark walnut, an antique his father had sourced and restored, and given him when he bought the penthouse, too large for the room in a way that had always privately pleased him. There was a gap of several inches between the back edge of the desk and the wall. He had never thought about this gap, because it was behind the desk, and behind the desk was not a place he ever looked. He got up. He moved around the desk. He crouched down and looked into the gap between the desk and the wall. He did not find the watch. What he found was a small cloth pouch, folded cotton, the kind kept in the household supply drawer, placed on the narrow window ledge that ran at skirting height along the wall behind the desk, at the exact point where something falling from the back of the desk surface would come to rest. Inside the pouch, the watch. And beneath it, tucked under the drawstring, a small folded note in handwriting he recognized from 2 years of household logs and supply lists and the careful, precise annotations Rose left on everything she considered worth recording. The note said, "Found behind the desk during Tuesday's clean. Placed here for safekeeping. Will tell Mr. Hale at the end of shift. R. V." She had not reached the end of the shift. He had not given her the chance. He sat on the floor behind the desk with the cloth pouch in his hands and the watch inside it, and the note unfolded on his knee, and he stayed there for a long time, not moving, not thinking in any organized way, simply receiving, fully and without defense, the weight of what he had done and what it had cost. Penelope had been in the entrance hall on Tuesday. He had registered this at the time without attaching significance to it. She visited the apartment regularly, had her own key, came and went with the proprietary ease of a firstborn child who has never entirely relinquished the household to a step-family configuration. She was 27, capable, and possessed of a quality he had long identified, but declined to name directly, a talent for being in the right place when information of use to her became available, and for ensuring it reached the relevant party in the form most likely to produce the outcome she preferred. She had not told him the watch was gone. She had simply been present when he discovered it was, and she had said, in the thoughtful, careful tone she used for things she had already decided, "I did notice Rose spent a long time in the study today." He had done the rest himself. He had always done the rest himself. That was what made it effective. He called his lawyer at 8:15. He called the building's household agency at 8:30. He had Rose's address from her employment file, which he had pulled with the specific, suppressed urgency of a man who has recognized a mistake and is now moving at the speed the mistake deserves. He drove himself. He did not call ahead because he had not earned the courtesy of advance warning. He had taken that from her on Tuesday in the entrance hall, and he could not restore it by telephone. The drive was 40 minutes, out of the city center, and through the gradual unwinding of the city's wealthier grammar, the glass-fronted restaurants giving way to takeaways, the wide pavements narrowing, the trees disappearing from the verges and reappearing when they appeared at all, as the self-seated kind that push up through cracked concrete on their own initiative. The streetlights changed character, from the curated warmth of the city center to the flat, functional orange of streets that are lit for visibility rather than atmosphere. Marcus drove through it in a car that cost more than most of the annual rents on these streets, and felt the distance between his world and hers, not as a judgment, but as a fact, specific and physical, the way class always is, when you cross its lines deliberately, when the crossing is a choice you made, and you have no origin story here to justify your presence. Rose lived on the second floor of a terraced house that had been converted into flats at some point in the past 30 years, the conversion legible in the two separate doorbells and the slightly mismatched brickwork above the left-hand window where a wall had been removed and rebuilt. The street was quiet in the way working streets are quiet on Thursday evenings, not empty, but settled. The particular stillness of a neighborhood that has finished its day and is not performing for anyone. A woman 2 doors down was putting out a bin. A child's bicycle was chained to a fence with a padlock that cost more than the bicycle. Somewhere inside one of the houses, a television. The ordinary, unphotographed texture of how most people live. He walked up the staircase, which smelled of old carpet and cooking, and the specific warmth of a building that has housed people long enough to absorb their presence into its walls. He knocked. There was a pause long enough for him to understand she had looked through the spy hole and was deciding. Then the door opened. Rose Voss looked at him the way a person looks at someone who has no right to be at their door, and has come anyway. The look containing neither welcome nor hostility, only the steady, assessing attention of a woman who has learned that unexpected appearances are rarely uncomplicated, and who intends to understand this one before she responds to it. He held out the cloth pouch. He said, "I found your note." She looked at it for a moment. Then she stepped back and let him in. The flat was small and ordered with the specific economy of a person who has learned to make a limited space function completely, not with the bare, pared-down quality of someone who has given up on comfort, but with the considered arrangement of someone who has decided exactly what matters and given everything that matters its correct position. A low bookshelf along one wall, filled with the kind of books that have been read rather than displayed, spines creased, some with folded corners, a few with slips of paper protruding at intervals. A kitchen table with 2 chairs positioned at angles that suggested they had been used for conversation rather than meals eaten in silence. On the counter, a row of plants in mismatched pots, terracotta, plastic, one repurposed tin, all of them healthy. The kind of healthy that comes from genuine and consistent attention rather than the intermittent guilty watering of a person who means well. On the table, weighted flat at the corners with a mug, a small stone, the salt shaker and a folded paper, Lily's drawing. He recognized the handwriting in the corner immediately. Lily always signed her name in the lower right with the oversized capital L of a child who takes the authorship of things seriously. He could not see the drawing from where he stood, but the fact of it being there, tacked to the table and weighted as though it were a document worth preserving, which it was, which it clearly was to Rose, was enough. He said, "I owe you an apology." She said yes. He said, "I didn't give you the chance to speak." She said no. He said, "I would like to give you that chance now, if it's not too late." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I put it somewhere safe, Mr. Hale. I put it where I knew it couldn't be lost. I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner. I was afraid you'd think exactly what you thought. He said, "That was my failure, not yours." She said, "It was both." He said, "Yes." The words sat between them with the specific weight of an admission that has been arrived at honestly rather than extracted under pressure. Rose looked at him, at his face, not at the pouch, not at the room, with the direct attention she brought to all things she was evaluating carefully. He did not look away. She said, "The children." He said, "They haven't eaten since Tuesday." She said, "I know. Lily sent me a message on Wednesday. She has my number from the household emergency list." She paused. "I told her to eat. She said she would think about it." He said, "She said something to me tonight." Rose said, "What did she say?" He told her. He said it simply, the way Lily had said it, without editorial, without the protective framing that adults add to children's words to make them more manageable or less precise. He said it and watched Rose receive it with the expression of a woman who had spent 2 years teaching 2 children what kindness required and was now hearing, at second hand, that they had understood it well enough to use it. She said, after a moment, "She's a remarkable child." He said, "She is. They both are." He paused. "I'd like you to come back, not as a favor, as a correction. The role you've been doing for 2 years without the title or the contract is head of household. I'd like to offer it to you formally, with everything that means." She said, "And Penelope?" He said, "Penelope will have a different relationship to this household going forward." Rose looked at the cloth pouch, still in his hands. She said, "The watch should go back on the desk. That's where he left it for you." He said, "Will you bring it back?" "Tomorrow, to the children." She said yes. She came the following morning at 9 o'clock, which was her usual arrival time, because the best form of restoration is the resumption of ordinary things. Lily met her at the door, not Noah, not the housekeeper, Lily, who had apparently been watching the entrance camera since 8:45 and had positioned herself at the door with the specific preparedness of a child who has decided that this arrival is not going to happen without her present for it. She opened the door and looked at Rose for a moment, and then put her arms around her waist without saying anything, the way children embrace things they have been afraid of losing. Completely, without self-consciousness, without any of the reserve that adults learn to perform in place of feeling. Rose held her for a moment with one hand flat on the back of her head, the way you hold something you have been relieved to find. Then she said, into the top of her head, "Have you eaten breakfast?" Lily said, into Rose's cardigan, "Not yet." Rose said, "Go and get Noah. I'll make eggs." The kitchen that morning had the kitchen's usual quality, the east window light coming in at the angle it came in at from September to March, flat and clean and clear. The kind of light that makes everything look as though it is being seen properly for the first time. The drawer that stuck, unless you lifted it as you pulled. The smell of coffee and warm bread that Rose had established in her first week, and that the children associated as children associate smells, not with a sensory category, but with a feeling, the particular feeling of a morning that was going to be all right. Marcus sat at the kitchen table and watched his children eat eggs and listened to Noah explain the card trick, which was more complicated than any card trick a 6-year-old had any business knowing, and which Rose had apparently been teaching him in increments across 4 separate shifts, which was, Marcus thought, exactly the kind of thing Rose would do, a thing worth doing, delivered in the right-size pieces, without rush. Penelope did not come to the apartment that week. She came the following Tuesday, in the late afternoon, when she knew Marcus would be home. She came because she was intelligent enough to understand that not coming would be its own statement, and she had always preferred to manage the terms of difficult conversations rather than to avoid them. Marcus met her in the study. The watch was on the desk. The Joseph Hale Memorial Bursary had been registered with the Family Foundation the day before, which she did not yet know. He told her, he said, "The bursary will fund vocational training and professional development for household and domestic staff, the kind of workers who keep houses like this running, whose professional development no one thinks to invest in, because we assume that the skill required to do the work is either obvious or unimportant. It's named after Dad because he believed, more than he could ever get me to believe fast enough, that you learn more about a person from how they treat the people who work for them than from any other single indicator. He paused. He also believed that when you've done something wrong, you name it clearly and you make it right specifically. Not vaguely, not with a gesture. Specifically, Penelope said, "I didn't tell you the watch was gone." He said, "I know what you did and didn't do. I'm not interested in a precise accounting. I'm interested in whether you understand why it mattered." She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "She's better at it than I expected." He said, "She's better at it than most people I've employed in any capacity. And she's been doing it for 2 years and 3 months without the title or the contract, which is a management failure I should have corrected long before Tuesday." Penelope looked at the watch on the desk. She said, in a voice that had something in it he had not heard from her before, not concession, something softer. The early form of something that might, with time, become honesty. He would have liked her. Marcus said yes, he would have. She left. They did not resolve everything in that room. Resolution is not a single conversation but a direction of travel, and they had at least established the direction. It was something. It was the beginning of something, which is the most that can be asked of any difficult afternoon. The formal gathering to announce the bursary was held 3 months later, in a room at the foundation, not the penthouse, neutral ground, the right size for the thing. Rose was there. Lily and Noah were there, in their good clothes, sitting in the front row with the particular patience of children who have been told the occasion is important and are taking it seriously. The bursary was announced with the full name, the Joseph Hale Memorial Bursary for Household and Domestic Staff Professional Development, and when the name was read aloud, Marcus heard Noah say to Lily, in a whisper that was not quite as quiet as he intended, "Grandpa's still here." Lily said, very quietly, "Yes." Afterwards, at the small dinner that followed, Rose placed the cloth pouch on the table in front of Marcus. She said, "I thought you should have it back properly, in front of people who know what it means." He opened the pouch. He lifted the watch out and set it on the table, and it sat there, silver-cased and initialed, the way it had sat on his father's workbench for 30 years before that and on his desk for 14 months after. He looked at it. The room was warm and full of conversation and the sound of his children somewhere behind him, and the watch sat on the table and was still. The way it had been still since the morning, he wound it for the last time after the funeral and set it down, and had not been able to pick it up again. Then it ticked. One tick, then another, then the steady, small, mechanical pulse of a thing that has remembered what it is for, the sound of his father's workshop on winter afternoons, the sound of attention paid to something small and precisely made, the sound of a man who believed that everything works if every part is where it belongs. Marcus looked at the watch and said nothing. Rose looked at it. Noah had gone quiet somewhere behind him. No one spoke. The tick continued, steady and unhurried, in the warm room, under the light, among the people who understood what it meant. Some things cannot be explained. Some things do not need to be. If you have ever been dismissed before you could explain yourself, if you have ever placed something carefully in the safest place you could find and been accused of stealing it, if you have ever loved someone else's children with the specific unasked-for love that arrives when a child needs it, and you are the person who is there, quietly, on your break time, on the ordinary Tuesdays and Thursdays of an unremarkable year, and been given no title for it, and no thanks for it, and no acknowledgement that it was the most important work being done in that house, then you already know what Rose Voss carried through those 2 years and 3 months, and you know that what a 9-year-old child said at a dinner table on a Thursday evening was not a child's sentence at all. It was the truest thing said in that household in a very long time, by the only person in the room honest enough and young enough to say it, and the least that can be asked of us, the least, The very minimum is that when a child tells us the truth, we stop and we listen, and we do not make her say it twice.